The Iraq War, which began in 2003, is widely regarded as one of the most controversial and consequential conflicts of the 21st century. Initially launched by the United States and its allies with the intent of toppling Saddam Hussein's regime and eliminating Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, the war quickly spiraled into a quagmire of violence, instability, and chaos. Over a decade later, the conflict's legacy continues to haunt the Middle East and the countries that participated in it. But how did a mission that started with clear objectives go so disastrously wrong? When the US and its coalition partners invaded Iraq in March 2003, they did so under the premise that Saddam Hussein possessed WMDs that posed an imminent threat to global security. This assertion was based on intelligence reports that were later revealed to be deeply flawed. In the lead-up to the war, the Bush administration presented these findings as irrefutable evidence to justify military action, convincing much of the American public and many international allies of the necessity of the invasion. However, as the war progressed and no WMDs were found, the credibility of the entire mission began to crumble. The absence of WMDs was the first major blow to the coalition's rationale for war. It quickly became apparent that the intelligence had been either exaggerated or misinterpreted, leading to widespread skepticism and anger among the public and the international community. The notion that the war had been based on a false premise eroded trust in the US government and its allies, leading to significant political fallout both at home and abroad. The failure to find WMDs not only undermined the legitimacy of the war, but also called into question the competence and integrity of the leaders who had championed it. As the initial military campaign against Saddam Hussein's forces proved successful, the coalition's focus shifted to the task of rebuilding Iraq. However, this phase of the war quickly revealed deep flaws in planning and execution. The US and its allies had not adequately prepared for the challenges of post-war reconstruction, and their lack of a coherent strategy led to a power vacuum that was quickly filled by insurgent groups, sectarian militias, and terrorist organizations. The dismantling of Iraq's military and the de-Baathification policy, which removed members of Saddam's party from government positions, left thousands of armed and disillusioned individuals without jobs or a stake in the new Iraq. Many of these individuals joined the insurgency, fueling a brutal and protracted conflict. The power vacuum and the rise of insurgent groups led to a vicious cycle of violence that the coalition forces struggled to contain. As Iraq descended into chaos, sectarian tensions between the Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations intensified, further destabilizing the country. The insurgency, which included former Baathists, nationalist groups, and jihadist organizations like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, waged a relentless campaign of attacks against coalition forces, the new Iraqi government, and civilians. The insurgents used guerrilla tactics, including roadside bombings, ambushes, and suicide attacks, making it nearly impossible for coalition forces to establish control and security. One of the most significant missteps in the post-invasion period was the failure to anticipate and address the deep-seated sectarian divisions within Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein's regime, the Sunni minority had dominated the government, while the Shia majority and Kurdish population were marginalized and oppressed. The removal of Saddam and the subsequent empowerment of Shia political leaders led to a backlash from Sunni communities, who feared retribution and loss of power. This sectarian strife quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war, with Shia and Sunni militias engaging in brutal campaigns of violence and retribution against each other. The conflict became increasingly complex, with multiple factions fighting for control and influence, further complicating the coalition's efforts to stabilize the country. The mismanagement of the reconstruction effort was compounded by the lack of sufficient troop numbers to maintain order and security. Despite warnings from military experts and officials, the Bush administration had pursued a strategy of light footprint, believing that a smaller, agile force would be sufficient to achieve its objectives. However, as the situation in Iraq deteriorated, it became clear that this approach was inadequate. The insufficient troop levels made it difficult to secure key areas, protect infrastructure, and prevent the insurgency from gaining strength. The result was a prolonged and bloody conflict that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of coalition soldiers. The human cost of the Iraq War was staggering. According to various estimates, between 200,000 and 500,000 Iraqis were killed as a result of the conflict, with millions more displaced from their homes. The war also took a heavy toll on coalition forces, with nearly 5,000 U.S. and Allied soldiers losing their lives and tens of thousands more wounded. The psychological impact on veterans was profound, with many returning home to face issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and other mental health challenges. The war left a generation of Iraqis traumatized and a country in ruins, its infrastructure destroyed and its society deeply divided. Beyond the immediate human and material costs, the Iraq War had far-reaching geopolitical consequences. The destabilization of Iraq created a power vacuum that was exploited by extremist groups, most notably ISIS, which emerged from the remnants of AQI and rapidly gained control over large swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria. The rise of ISIS posed a new and formidable threat to the region and the world, prompting another round of military interventions and further entrenching the cycle of violence and instability in the Middle East. The war also strained relations between the U.S. and many of its allies, particularly those in Europe who had opposed the invasion. The perceived unilateralism of the Bush administration and the failure to build a broad international coalition undermined America's standing on the world stage and damaged its credibility as a global leader. The war contributed to a growing sense of anti-Americanism in many parts of the world and fueled resentment and radicalization in the Middle East and beyond. Domestically, the Iraq War had significant political repercussions in the United States and other coalition countries. In the U.S., the war became a central issue in the 2004 and 2008 presidential elections, with public opinion turning increasingly against the conflict as the human and financial costs mounted. The war also sparked widespread protests and movements against what was seen as an unjust and illegal invasion. The failure to achieve the stated objectives and the subsequent chaos in Iraq eroded trust in the government and contributed to a broader sense of disillusionment with political leadership. Financially, the Iraq War was a colossal drain on resources. The U.S. alone spent over $2 trillion on the war, including costs related to military operations, reconstruction, and long-term care for veterans. The economic burden of the war had lasting effects on the U.S. economy, contributing to rising national debt and diverting resources from other critical needs. The financial cost of the war also raised questions about the priorities of government spending and the opportunity costs of engaging in such an expensive and protracted conflict. In the end, the Iraq War is often cited as a cautionary tale of the dangers of military intervention without a clear and achievable plan for the aftermath. The failure to find WMDs, the mismanagement of the reconstruction effort, the escalation of sectarian violence, and the rise of extremist groups like ISIS all contributed to the perception that the war was a disastrous and avoidable mistake. The legacy of the Iraq War continues to shape U.S. foreign policy and the broader international order, serving as a reminder of the complex and often unpredictable consequences of war. As we reflect on what went wrong in the Iraq War, it's important to remember the human cost and the lasting impact on those who lived through it. The lessons learned from Iraq should guide future decisions about military intervention and the importance of careful planning, realistic objectives, and a deep understanding of the complexities of the region. The Iraq War may have ended, but its lessons remain as relevant as ever in a world still grappling with the challenges of conflict and instability.